Are you curious about the NAR, National Association of Realtor settlement proposal, how these changes are occurring, what's being proposed, and what it may cause any changes in the actual industry, and what the opportunities are for agents? If that's something you're interested in and kind of my opinion on all that, you're in the right place. Welcome. Hey, this is the Rams agent coaching call, and our goal is to help our agents add 2 referral closings per month to their current production by implementing the referral agent mastery system into their practice and leveraging Rams marketing with EXP tools such as KV Core CRM and EXP Marketing Center. My name is Mike Cerrone. I'm the co-founder of Rams Agents at EXP, and we're going to go ahead and just jump right in. So let me go down to my notes. I want to make sure that I cover everything for you and start this off right. We have a lot of territory to cover, by the way, today. What I'm going to do, a quick outline, is I'm going to tell you what I'm going to show you what some of the items are that NAR is proposing. I'm going to give you then my opinion on how you can make some modifications and changes to your practice to capitalize on this. And then we're going to open up for any Q&A for any questions you may have. So the first thing I want to do is say this. I am pretty optimistic now that I've had time to calm down. I was like everybody else, kind of got pretty crazy there for a while with the changes, but then it kind of hit me, and maybe this will help you. I have 4 million reasons to be optimistic. Ready? 4 million reasons to be optimistic. Those 40 million reasons are every year, there are a minimum of 4 million real estate transactions in the residential real estate section across the United States. So in other words, 4 million people buy a house and 4 million people sell a house. So there's actually 8 million sides that occur every year as a minimum, right? That's in a down or slow or a market that's not very active as far as number of transactions. The numbers have been as high as 5 million, 6 million, 7 million. I think we hit a few years back. So it's kind of like a floor. People need to move, right? And they want to move. They want to get a home. They want to sell a home. They got all their reasons for why they're doing it. And here's the key. They need some help. Okay. They need someone to come in there and help them. That's why our industry was created and it's done so well for so long. So they don't care. These people don't care about NAR. They don't know what it is, don't care about it. They don't care about the DOJ, the Department of Justice. They don't care about any lawsuits. They don't care about lawyers making compensation. They don't care about buyer agents' compensation or seller agent compensation for that matter. They don't care about any of that. They'll deal with it if they have to, but they don't really care about it. What they care about is getting into a home or getting out of a home and making sure that their family is taken care of and their needs are met, right? That's what they care about. And so we stay in that space, we're going to do just fine. So whether there are real estate agents or not, whether the DOJ makes a change or not, whether buyer compensation is easy or not, these buyers and sellers want to move. They need some help doing it. So I'm very optimistic because of that. So that's where I want to start. Now, what I'm going to do for you, let me get this set up. I've got a couple things I want to share. And if you give me just a second, we're going to go ahead and get these done. I want to show you my screen. And let me show you, let me show you this first. Hold on, almost there. I'm kind of slow. I think I'd be faster at this. All right, here we go. So we're going to share this screen and here it goes. There you go. You should be seeing my screen right now. And I'm going to close this out so it doesn't hide anything. Sometimes if I don't do that, you can't see the screen well. All right, so I wanted to show you this page. This is actually a page out there on the internet. Why that's showing there. All right, so this is a page out there on the internet that you can go get right now. It's a 4-page document that NAR put out that gives a summary of what the changes are that they're proposing. And I should just say that this is all just a proposal. Okay, that's why proposal is in the name. It's just a settlement concept that they put out there. Still has to be approved by a judge. It possibly has to be approved by the DOJ. Nobody really knows at least publicly, what's going on in the background. So it may happen, it may not. Odds are it will, but we don't know for sure. All right, I just want to point that part out. We're just kind of speculating, and everybody here, including me out there, is just speculating based on the limited information we have. You can go out there and find, though, this settlement fact sheet and see what is being proposed and just get the facts, because there's a lot of stuff out there in the media that's hyping things up. Gurus are hyping things up. That's fine. Just get the facts and go check it out. And to get here, by the way, just go into Google and type in NAR, N-A-R, National Association of Realtors, and then type in settlement fact sheet. And it's going to pop up as an option, and it's this nice PDF, and you can just see all 4 pages here. There we go. And you can just see all 4 pages. Now, what I've done is I've read through here, and I picked out the top 10 things that kind of popped out at me, and I just copied and pasted them over. And I'm going to show those to you real quick, and then I'm going to explain where I think the opportunities are. So let me go ahead and show that to you. All right, so here are some of the ideas that you're going to want. Now, here was the link, if you can see that. If you don't have, I'm sure you have Google and you do Google search, but there's the actual link itself that you're going to go to. That's what's going to pop up in your options. Down here, I wrote out these 10 statements. Oh, that was funky. Let's see, there we go, the 10 statements. And I want to just run through them so you know what NAR is actually saying. So number one that I think affects us the most, and that's right here, the settlement provides that the MLS participants, and that's the majority of us, working with buyers, must enter into a written representative agreement with those buyers. And yeah, I think it comes up here. That, by the way, that change is going to go into effect, they say, mid-July. Again, this has to get all approved, so they don't really have a firm date. The MLS participants acting for the buyer is going to be required, or would be required, remember it's a proposal, to enter into a written agreement with buyers before touring a house. So as a practical item, you're just going to want to make sure you go through buyer agency, or whatever your arrangement's going to be with them, and that you sign some kind of employment agreement with them prior to going out and taking a look at houses. Now, that may sound radical, but I've been doing that for 30 years because I'm here in Colorado. In 1993, we changed our law to add buyer agency, transaction broker, dual agency, all the way back in 93. We've been experimenting for a long time. Luckily, I came in that year, and I've just been doing buyer agency ever since then. I didn't work with a buyer without a signed agreement. So it's actually pretty easy if you get into the practice of doing it, and it protects you, and the buyer understands what's going on, and it's actually pretty cool. You should actually do it anyway. But this is saying you got to do it now. It's not an option, because a lot of people are thinking it as an option before you can go take a look at the first home, and then after that you could get the buyer agency signed. And then every state is different. Every state's different on all their rules, and a lot of them said that basically you had to get some type of agreement in place before you wrote the offer, whatever. This is all going to get changed nationally if this goes through, where you have to get the buyer agency signed before you tour the first house. All right, so that's a big change for a lot of people. Next, NAR's agreed to put in place a new rule prohibiting offers of compensation in the MLS. This is the one that's got everybody worked up, and it should, because it's going to make a change in our industry, a pretty good shift. And by not being able to put that universal offer of compensation out to a buyer agent from the listing agent, that's a pretty radical change to the way things have been done. And that's supposed to go into effect in July. We're going to talk about some of the opportunities and how to handle that in a minute, but that's the big one that's got everybody kind of freaked out. And as I said, it should. When they originally brought the initial agreement out, by the way, it didn't have this. It just said that you could put, it had originally said, it already said for most MLSs, you had to put at least $1 in. And then the original change was going to be to make it, you could do $0 instead of $1. And so I didn't see that that was going to be any kind of change for our industry. I thought that was pretty minor. But now this is a little bigger, because it's going to create some challenges for us. And we're going to go into that and where I think, again, these opportunities are. But keep that in mind. That's the big one. Next is we were able to, and again, this has come from NAR. I just clipped right out of their agreement, their statement here. Hey, we are able to retain the right of consumers to continue to have cooperative compensation. So that's the listing agent giving the buyer agent some compensation as an option, so long as they pursue it off MLS. So it's okay to do it. You just can't do it on the MLS, which is really driving people crazy, and it should, because that doesn't make any damn sense, right? But anyway, excuse my French. That's just my opinion. I'll keep my opinions till later. Anyway, through negotiation and consultation with real estate professionals. So they're basically saying you can't offer compensation through the MLS, but you could do it somewhere else. On some other website, you could do it face to face, you could do it over the phone. There's other ways to do it. You can do text message, email, whatever. Just can't do it on the MLS. Well, that's all fine and dandy, except that creates a lot of confusion, a lot of extra steps. And I'm going to show you, I think, a very simple solution for this, by the way, that we're going to come up to. But let's keep going down. Those are the majors, by the way, and now I'm just going to hit some of the backups. Next is after the new rule goes into effect, listing brokers and sellers could continue to offer compensation to buyer broker services, but such offers cannot be communicated via the MLS. I think they already said that, actually, so they've repeated. And next, it's the settlement expressly provides that sellers may communicate seller concessions, such as a buyer agent closing costs. All right, so a lot of people think this could be the potential solution, is that instead of having an exact field for seller compensation, they're going to, for co-op compensation for buyer agents, they're going to have a separate field where a seller would give a concession to a buyer and just offer that up front. And you're like, why would they do that? Well, in a hot market, it doesn't happen, but as markets slow down, it starts to pick up, because that's how you attract buyers. That is one term, or one that you could offer out there. And in fact, I just heard recently, I don't know if it's true, I don't have any backup on this, but I heard recently that they've surveyed MLSs all over the nation, and up to 50% of sellers are already offering some type of seller compensation to the buyer through the MLS right now, even though our market is still relatively strong. When the market goes soft, if you've been an old veteran like me, and I know a lot of you are listening that have been, it goes completely crazy, right? That's one of the things we used to do, was offer higher co-op compensation to attract a buyer, and more terms to get a buyer to come in. That was to attract a buyer agent, but to attract a buyer, we'd offer carpet allowances and painting allowances, and we'll pay your closing costs, all kinds of stuff, right? Well, that's going to come back as the market softens. So anyway, what the people think is that maybe you put your buyer broker compensation in this different field, which was talking about seller concessions. And I'll just say this, the limit or the problem with that is that the lenders, if your buyer has to get a mortgage, the lenders have restrictions in their guidelines as to how much can be paid through those seller concessions. So if someone's getting, in the old days it was called a carpet allowance, painting allowance, they've just generically now call it seller concessions. If somebody was getting X percent, let's say 3% through there, and the limit is 3%, well, there's no room now left to put in a compensation for a buyer's agent. Okay, that's where it becomes a challenge to kind of work it through there as a workaround. But it could happen. That may be a solution. Again, I'm going to give you mine in a little bit. We're almost there, by the way. Here's another one. NAR will pay $418 million settlement over approximately 4 years, $100 million a year. The way I understand it is, and the attorneys are going to get paid first, their big percentage, and then a couple bucks will go out to the plaintiffs, the sellers. And I mean, like a couple bucks. It's not estimated to be very big, like 10 bucks each, 100 bucks each, I don't know. But the lawyers made out like bandits. They were able to, in my opinion, kind of blackmail the industry and put them over their knee. And that's the other thing about this agreement. My understanding is this is being written up by those lawyers, which is really blowing my mind that it's not a government agency making the changes to our industry that's affecting us nationally, and of course all the buyers and sellers nationally as well. But anyway, that's what's being proposed. They're going to pay out this $418 million, which means that's going to come from the members, because that's who has the money. So that's who's going to pay. And a lot of agents, by the way, are thinking, well, I don't want to be part of NAR. I understand, makes sense. I can understand why you think that way. I don't always like what NAR does, by the way. I think they made a lot of bumbling mistakes over the years, like giving away our MLS data in the first place, selling Realtor.com, all kinds of mistakes that have happened over the years. But here's the deal. NAR is our association as real estate agents, residential side, where we come together and we have some power in helping and assisting and pushing around and lobbying for changes in Congress. And that's the big one. Nobody talks about it, or doesn't talk about enough. That's what NAR really does for us. They make sure that our industry stays intact. Obviously, this looks like a giant failure, and maybe it is, because nobody can be perfect. And unfortunately, this is going against us in a big way. At least it looks like that. I'm going to give you the opportunities in a minute. However, NAR is there to make sure that home buying is a big deal. They do a lot of advocacy for home buyers and first-time home buyers, making sure the industry has a lot of good tax breaks and all kinds of cool stuff. If you want to see all that disappear, then yeah, just tell NAR to go jump in a lake and disappear, and you watch how fast our little value proposition in Congress is going to disappear, because there's nobody advocating for us. So that's something you should keep in mind when you're thinking about no longer keeping NAR. Yeah, you'll save a couple bucks, but you may lose a lot more. That's all I'm saying. But it really is kind of scary that they're going to pay out this big of an award, and we know who's going to get it. The attorneys, unfortunately, are going to get the biggest chunk. But it's good for them. Anyway, moving along. I am throwing my opinion in here everywhere, aren't I? But we're almost done with the list. And then again, I'm going to show you the opportunities. So per individual agents, you probably want to know this. NAR their proposal does a release and covers all members other than agents affiliated with. There's a couple people still outstanding on the lawsuits. I wish, by the way, that NAR would still be filing their appeal, but I understand why they're doing this, because the numbers were getting really big and scary. But apparently Home Services of America is still fighting it. And so their company and their agents were not covered by this proposal, as well as their employees and other folks. And so that means that every other agent, though, just regular individual agent, little agent running around who's a member of NAR, is, and again, I'm not a lawyer. My understanding is that then they will not have a threat of being sued. I don't think it was possible anyway. I mean, the lawyer's not going to sue a regular agent for $10, because there's not enough money for them to make it worth their while. However, as an aggregate, as a group, it was. All right, so that's one thing that's kind of nice. If you're in the group that was taken care of, the individual agents outside of this one particular company who's still fighting, which I do admire, by the way. I hope Home Services of America wins and everybody else feels kind of dumb, but here we go. Keep going. Per brokerages, this is kind of interesting. Basically what it says is that if you're a brokerage under $2 billion, I know that sounds like a big number, but that's sales volume, under 2 billion of sales each year. And I think the year was 2022. If it's under that amount, then you are also protected with this NAR. In other words, there's no liability for you. But if you're over 2 billion and above in annual sales volume in 2022, then you are still game for these vultures, it's just my opinion, these attorneys to come in and pick your bones and to basically sue you and try to extort money out of you as well. Again, my opinion. And I understand, I don't have backup on this, but my understanding is about 130 companies nationally that would qualify for this and are still exposed. And so a lot of people are upset about that NAR didn't protect them. Obviously, the attorneys wrote up this agreement with NAR, and the attorneys obviously threw this in so they could continue to beat up our industry and go after companies and try to, as I said, extort money. And that's my opinion. But that's the fact. That's what they said. All right, next. And the fact being that if you're above 2 billion, you're not covered by this agreement. Next, per the realtor associations, NAR did protect themselves. So NAR is released from liability nationwide on the selling side. People are making that distinction versus the buyer side, because there are buyer lawsuits out there now that have not been resolved. These are just the seller side lawsuits and all their copycats. But on the seller side, NAR is released from liability. All their officers, directors, individuals, right? They covered their own rear end, which was smart. That's fine. But also the smaller state, territorial, and local associations were released as well. Next are the MLSs. Now, NAR, the realtors created the MLS way back in the day, back in the 60s and 70s. They all kind of, depending on where you were, they were coming about because they discovered cooperation was easier. That's another history lesson of why this is so silly in the first place. But anyway, cooperation came about, and so these MLSs were popping up, and most of them were owned by the Realtor Association, the local Realtor Association, and that continues today. Some have spun out, like in my area in Colorado, I'm pretty sure they spun out. Maybe I'm wrong. I've never looked at their ownership, but for instance, in our area for a long time, you have not had to be part of the realtors in order to be part of the MLS. They broke that out over a decade ago. And so in our area, it's a mix. But anyway, in a lot of areas, the MLS is actually still heavily controlled by the local association. And so that's why those are being included in this group. If your MLS is covered by, is controlled by your realtor association, then that MLS is being dealt with in this agreement as well. And it's going to also provide, and that's why those MLSs are going to have to make those changes. MLSs that are outside of realtor control, they are not bound to this, and so they could continue to offer buyer agent compensation or compensation to an agent working with a buyer. However, it's going to be up to them, and if they don't, they could then be sued and under this, and so that's why there's a quote mechanism for them to slide under. By the way, there was a mechanism to slide under the agreement if you were a brokerage over $2 billion as well. We don't know what any of those terms are. I'm sure it comes down to paying out the plaintiffs and therefore the attorneys some large amount. But again, I don't know. We're not privy to all that. There, I had to give you the background, and I'm sorry it took so long, but that's the background and that's some clarity. Again, just go over to the NAR settlement sheet if you want to read it yourself and see exactly what it is. Now for the fun part. Now I want to share with you what I think the big opportunities are here moving forward. Okay, let's do that. So first of all, as I think I've already said, I'll say it again, all this is my opinion and thought. It's not legal advice in any way. And so you want to definitely double check all this with your broker and lawyer to make sure that everything is cool. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to break out and just talk to you face to face so we can chat about this. So number one is, I mentioned already that I have a big optimism because there's 4 million reasons why you should still be hunky-dory. You're going to figure out a solution to this one way or the other because people need us, right? Computers have not been able to take over our industry. They've been saying that ever since I started back in '93. I remember Microsoft was the big powerhouse in the tech world, and they were going to take over real estate. And basically, Gates analyzed it and said, Bill Gates, and he said, this is crazy. This industry is all split up and splintered, and all this personal time to make the deal work, where the agent is in there dealing with the emotional side of the business. It's such a big thing. It's just not going to happen. Now, is that still true? I don't know, but I think so. I think it is true that people still need us. We'll find out over the next couple of years. But people have always been able to sell their home on their own. They've been able to sell it on the website and do these other things, and they keep coming back to our industry for a reason. All right. So I'm very optimistic those 4 million transactions that happen every year are still going to need us and require us as a real estate agent. And you should be optimistic too. So if you start to get worried about all this, just remember 4 million. I think we're going to be fine. All right. All right. Excuse me. I'm going to get a little water. All right. So what I'm going to share now is what I think is the big agent opportunity. And this is just kind of a thought. I think that referral agents, agents who work with their past clients and their sphere of influence, their friends and family and acquaintances, they're going to be fine. They're going to have a big advantage moving into this new world because your PCSOI, your past client and sphere of influence, they already know you, right? They already know you. They like you, they trust you, and they're going to listen to you. They're going to listen to your advice. They're going to listen to your recommendations. And I think that they're going to follow along with what you think they should be doing, as long as you share your confidence in your direction. So make sure that's what you're doing when you're out there. I think referral agents are going to do well. Now, if you're working with a bunch of strangers, it's going to be a little harder, okay? Because you're going to be negotiating against a lot of other people, a lot of other agents, a lot of other confusion being thrown out there in the market. There's no relationship to build off of and create that level of trust, and so that people are listening to your recommendations. I think that's going to be a bit harder. So that's the reason I think you should really dig in and build those trenches around your business. Okay, your moat, as oh, I'm trying to remember his name. It's off the top of my head. But anyway, building a moat around your business, where you're protecting it. And in this case, it's your PCSOI, and you build your relationships. That's the moat. Okay, it's hard for someone else, a competitor, to come in and cross that moat because you've created a strong relationship. So I recommend that you dig in and build those relationships, have a lot of conversations with people, talk to your people, reach out to your people, send out documentation to your people and your statements to their people as you're learning this whole new world, and basically keep them calm that, hey, I'm still here to help you. This is some weird bump in the road. And in fact, most people probably don't even know about this in the general public unless they're in the market to buy and sell right now. They probably aren't even, they might have heard it and they're like, oh, okay. They're going to forget about it in a week because their life is going to happen. We're in the trenches and we're dealing with it. So we think it's a hyper important issue. And it is to us, but not to most people. So anyway, you could start, you need to educate them on what's happening and keep those lines of communication open. I think as a referral agent, you're going to be in a strong position to do that. Might be a little choppier, as I said, with people you don't know. All right, let's now go into the listing agent opportunity. This is big. So if you are a listing agent, and most agents, by the way, they're doing some business listing and some business buyer, but if you're heavier on the listing side, or any listing that you take, you're going to have a little bit more power now. And here's what I mean. You're going to have a little more opportunity now to do what in the old days we called a double-ended deal. A double-ended deal. Now, I've heard that term elsewhere, so I want to clarify it and let you know what I mean by that. For to me, a double-ended transaction means that you're working with the seller and you're also working with the buyer. As I said, seller isn't me because I'm the listing agent, but you're working with the seller and you're working with the buyer. You're working with both of them. You bring them together. Now, every state talks about that situation differently. And so obviously follow your state laws because that's what controls you and your license. In our area, way back in 1993, when I got my license 30 years ago, Colorado was on the frontier and we brought in buyer agency, dual agency, transaction brokerage. And there's always been another one called customer. And we dealt with that. And in Colorado, and by the way, dual agency went away years ago for us because of all the lawsuits that were popping up. I practiced dual agent way back in the day, and it was pretty good as long as you knew exactly where you sat and you explained everything to everybody. Everybody was fine with it. Same with transaction brokerage. That's where you're neutral. Dual agency, you're actually representing each side. Transaction broker, you're neutral on each side. And then you could represent one side, like say the listing, and the other side, you could treat them as a customer, or you could be a buyer agent and treat the other side as a customer, like a FISBO. We just had to do full disclosure in all those situations. And by the way, again, I'm not giving legal advice. Go talk to your broker, and you probably already know all your rules. But here's the point. Listing agent is going to have a huge opportunity to double in more transactions because of the confusion. A lot of these buyers that don't have relationships with agents are probably going to go directly to the listing agent. And we don't know that. It's already happened in the past, but we don't know for sure, but it's very likely that that's going to happen. Another thing that may happen, by the way, is that you're working with the buyer and the seller and you bump into more double-ended transactions because your buyer doesn't have as many, at least perceived, and this is what people are expecting, opportunities to work with other agents because of all this confusion. And so they're going to go to you to put the deal together. Okay. So interestingly, in my career, at my height, the height of my career doing the most transactions, which was 113 in 1 year, I double ended about 25% of my transactions where I worked with both the seller and the buyer. And that was because I maybe had a listing and I was advertising and promoting it, and I was bringing in buyer leads and then connecting them together. Or I already had a buyer in my pool, or I already had a buyer in my relationship, right, in my PC, in my SOI, my sphere of influence, or it could be past client too. Anyway, I was bringing those together. I think that the opportunity to double in is going to go up quite a bit, and you should prepare for that. Okay, that's my big point here. Is it's an opportunity. You should get excited about it. Get a listing. You should go out there and start advertising that listing a little more than you may have done in the past out to the general public, and with the idea that you're going to bring a buyer in and you're going to work with them to put this transaction together. And you should be thinking about conceptually how that's going to look before it happens so you can explain it to people. Okay. So, as an example, you got to decide, are you going to treat that, if you're working with the seller, the listing agent, are you going to treat that buyer as a customer? Are you going to treat them as an agency relationship? So you're going to be their client. And so are you going to have a buyer agency with them and then a seller agency with the seller list? And you're going to be the dual agent if your state allows that. Are you going to remain neutral, be transaction broker on both sides? Okay. And then be a transaction broker in the middle. Are you going to be, like I said, that the old version, the old version that used to be forever, which was, hey, I am the listing agent and somebody comes in to buy, that's fine. I'll help you write it up, but that's a customer. Now, I've heard people getting nervous about this, and let's go into this a little bit about, hey, what does this mean as far as my compensation? If I'm charging X, and I'm just going to throw some numbers out, you can charge whatever you want. In fact, I'm going to make some numbers that may or may not be representative of where you're at, depending on your market, because I've actually heard of so many different numbers out there. And myself have practiced with so many different numbers. So that's why this whole lawsuit is really insane to me, but whatever. Let me just throw this out. If you're a listing agent, and in the old days, before this change, you charged 10% to sell a house. And then, by the way, in fact, let me just do this. Let me go back historically. I think this really will help because I haven't heard people talking about the history of what's been out there. So I'm just old enough now, I guess, that I saw this transition early on. And prior to 93 in my area, we had a thing called seller sub-agency. And the way that that worked was, in fact, if you go back even before that, go all the way back to say the 1930s and 40s, way back 100 years ago. And basically what you did is a seller wanted to sell a home. They would go and find an agent, or an agent would find them, and they would start talking. And the agent say, hey, let me sell your home. If you let me sell your home, I'll get it done for you and get it done great. And the seller said, okay, fine. How much are you going to charge me? And they're like, I'm going to charge you 10%. Okay. Great. The seller finally says, yeah, that sounds like a lot, but I need this home sold. I haven't been able to do it on my own or whatever. Fine. I'll give you 10%. That agent, that individual agent or the broker would go out and try to find a buyer for that house. They were the only one in the market searching for a buyer for the house. Okay. And it took a long time to find a buyer. It would be difficult to go find the buyer by yourself. Think about how hard it would be. Okay. I told you, I did 25% of the time on my hot year, but I was spending a lot of money to make that happen. Okay. I was doing a lot of reach out to make that happen. It's difficult, but that's what they did in the old days, way back. The agent would get hired, and the agent would go out and look for all the people they know. They would advertise, they would go meet people in the street, they would do open houses, they would knock on doors, they would just look in their database of people that they knew. They would talk to other people, anywhere they could find people. They would say, hey, I got this house over 123 Elm Street. Do you want to buy it? You know? And that's what they did. And eventually it would either sell or it wouldn't. And a lot of times it just wouldn't sell. And if it did sell, it might take a long time. When I say a long time, I'm talking 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years. It might take a long time to sell the home. Now, after a while, agents started to get in the business and they started talking to one another. And what happens is they would just personally, one-on-one say, hey, I got this property on 123 Elm Street. I'm having a hard time getting it sold. And the other agent would say, tell me more about that property. And they would tell them about the property. The second agent would say, I actually have somebody who might be interested, a buyer. Can I show them that property? And the first agent said, well, yeah, but why would you do that? The second agent says, well, maybe you could share the commission with me, right? Maybe you could give me some of the commission. And just for simplicity, let's say they agreed to split it 50-50. And fine, they brought the buyer in, the buyer liked it, they wrote the contract up, the agents then split the commission. They're like, wow, that was pretty cool. We actually got a property sold faster than normal. And then just, again, this takes years and decades, but eventually they started to do this more and more and more often. And they start to see that it was so much easier to get a home sold. The sellers were getting their properties sold faster. They were getting more money. Buyers were happy because they have more options to look at other than just a couple of properties with their agent or just a couple of properties they saw in the newspaper or wherever they saw it, driving around. It just became a better market. And it created this co-op concept where they created a formality to it. And they start to share the data, and that became the multiple listing service, okay, where they were sharing this data together. And part of that sharing was not only do I have this house on Elm Street, but hey, if you bring me a buyer, I'll pay you some commission. Over the years, they said, well, how much commission? And they formally put a field in there that said, this is how much we'll pay you if you bring us a buyer. Now, in the old days, before 93 that I'm aware of, there were buyer agents, but it was pretty rare because in the old days, they created a thing called seller sub-agency. And the concept there was, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, they were like, hey, look, the commission is coming from the seller. And because the commission is coming from the seller, we should go ahead and I was just realizing maybe you guys don't even care about this. But anyway, since the commission was coming from the seller, everybody needed to work for the seller. Okay, the listing agent was already working for the seller. And the seller said, hey, if I'm going to pay another agent to bring me a buyer, that's fine, but I want them working for me legally. Okay, I want them looking out for my best interest because I'm writing the check. And so that's the way it worked. So you did get to split the commission, and the agent working next to the buyer was working next to the buyer, but they weren't working for the buyer, right? Okay, but that's fine. Decades that the business worked that way. And so the seller sub-agent was the agent working next to the buyer, and then the listing agent was the agent working with the seller. And the seller sub-agent legally worked underneath or worked for that listing broker who worked for the seller. Woo, crazy stuff, right? All right, but it worked. It worked for decades. It worked for decades. But then eventually buyers said, whoa, I don't have any representation in this deal. And some lawsuits started happening because more and more lawyers popped up. And they started suing everybody. And eventually, different areas, for various reasons, depending on how your state operates, the states basically were saying, hey, we need to start changing something. And each state would handle this problem differently. Colorado, where I'm at, just happened to handle it early. And so in 93, we said, hey, let's try this crazy experiment where the co-op compensation, it's going to the agent working with the buyer anyway. We want the buyer to have a representation now called buyer agency. So in order to make that work, we're going to do some crazy logic. And the crazy logic is this. Basically, the buyer is paying for the price of the home. Since that's true, the buyer has skin in the game, and the buyer has got some money that they're putting in, and they want some of that money to go to their agent. Okay, and so the buyer instructs the seller to pay their agent. That was the trick. The buyer who's writing the offer says, hey, I got an agent. I want you to pay my agent. Okay, this is important to know. That's how we got buyer agency to work, at least around here, and I assume the rest of the states as well, was that concept. The buyer's writing the check and actually putting the money in. So the buyer has some power because they're part of this negotiation between the buyer and seller in the purchase contract. And the buyer is instructing the seller to pay their agent. And the seller then instructs the listing agent to pay the other agent, the buyer's agent. Okay, and that kind of filled the loop. All right, that's how it worked. Why were sellers willing to do that? Why were sellers willing to say, okay, that agent over there working next to the buyer no longer works for me, works for the buyer? You know why? Because sellers don't care. Sellers don't care. Sellers just want the home sold. Sellers just want the home sold, okay? And that's all they care about. They want to sell the home and move on to the next thing, right? That's the emotional thing they need to have happen. And then logically, how it works, fine. Most sellers don't really care. As long as they get the money they expected, they're happy and they can move on with their lives. Whatever you silly agents call it and do, fine, do all your gymnastics you want over there. I just want to get my home sold. And the buyers do the same thing. I just want to get into the home that I want to go buy. All right. So this was kind of a thing inside of our industry where we're doing all this craziness and the state and everything trying to make this work so that the buyer could have a representative and the seller could have a representative. So it's nice and clean and logical in our heads, and we can move forward and maybe we'll have fewer lawsuits. And we probably did have fewer lawsuits, but the lawsuits didn't go away. We just have fewer. And now instead of a buyer suing the seller, the buyer is suing their own agent. Anyway, but you get the point. That's how they solved it. And you need to know that kind of that history. And now today, this entity, this private entity, this group of lawyers doing a class action lawsuit is saying, oh, you can't do it that way. Now, even though you've been doing it for 30 years that way, don't do that way anymore. Because we think the buyer is not having enough control over how much commission is being paid to their buyer as far as the percentages and so forth. All right, like the buyer even cared. The buyer just wants to get in the home. The one that it mattered to was the seller, and the seller was negotiating all those monies with their agent to make it all work and to split it out because the seller wanted the home sold. All right. So that's why anybody who's sitting here in the industry is going, this new solution doesn't make any sense, right? How is a buyer going to be negotiating their fee and paying their fee? Buyer agency's been around for 100 years. You could go hire your own agent at any time. It just never caught on because buyers didn't want to pull money out of their pocket to go get representation. I heard a great example the other day, and it's true. If you go buy a car, you could bring an agent in to help you. You could hire a buyer agent or representative to help you buy. And I know people who've done that. But it's very rare. It never caught on because nobody wants to pull extra money out of their pocket. And that's just for a car. A house is 10 times more expensive, and the commission and the fee is 10 times more expensive. So this is going to make a radical change in our industry if this actually goes through. Whew, that was a long-winded answer. Here's where, let's go back to the opportunity for listing agent. Listing agent, double in your transaction. Okay, so listing agents going to be able to double in more transactions because they're going to be drawing in their own buyers, just like the old days. That's why I gave you the history. Just like the old days, you go find your own buyer. May or may not happen, but you're going to try. You're going to go out there and you're going to advertise through all the mediums you can think of. Now we have internet, and now you have social media. That would be something they didn't have 100 years ago, but you're going to try to go out there, expose the property, and bring somebody in to buy the home through you. If you do that, you got to have the arrangement set in your mind. Here's the point that I think people are missing, and it's the reason I went through all that. If you were to go get hired prior to this change, and you went to your seller and you said, "Hey, I'm going to get 10. I want to sell your home," and the seller says, "Well, how much are you going to charge me?" And you say 10%, and the seller says, "Fine." And you and the seller talk, and you say, "Hey, but we should offer co-op compensation to try to attract buyer agents who are working with buyers that are already in the market. They've already been pre-qualified. They're ready to go. Let's just go ahead and try to attract them in. I'll just take my commission to 10%. I'll split it up and I'll offer something to them. For simplicity, we're going to say 50-50, but you don't have to do that, by the way. It could be 60-40 or 70-30, or you do whatever you want. But for simplicity, we'll say 50-50. So I will promote out there 5% to buyer agents who bring us a buyer and successfully close. And the seller says, why did you do that? Because I get more offers. And the seller says, I like more offers. Let's go for it. And they do that. That's what happened before. Now, with the change, you can no longer offer the 5% out there to everybody and to all the buyer agents. And so the theory is this. Oh, well, there are going to be listing agents then that go out to the seller and say, hey, instead of you paying 10, why don't you just pay me 5? And we'll just not worry about the other 5 anymore. You just keep paying me 5. And sellers probably say, sure, why that sounds fine to me. But you have to clarify with the seller. That means, hey, if there is any other agent out there, this 5 does not include any co-op compensation. And Okay, maybe the seller understands, maybe they don't. Again, it's going to create a lot of confusion out there. That's why you got to educate. But people are worried, oh my gosh, now I just get 5. And if I'm a listing agent and a buyer comes to me direct, now what happens? Do I have to work both sides of the deal for just the 5, where before I was making 10? You know, if that were to happen in the prior to this change, if you had brought in the buyer, you would get 10, right? And so that's why you had an incentive to go out there and find a buyer. That's the way I used to phrase it, by the way, with sellers. Um, and it's true, I had an incentive to go find a buyer myself because I made the whole commission. That's the way we used to talk about the whole commission rather than splitting it up. So, in any event, staying on the storyline here, which I didn't think was going to take this long, but here we are. So, you got this 50%. You're thinking, boy, I'm only working for half of the commission, and I'm going to have to work with the buyer and the seller, and I'm going to do double the work for half the pay. And I understand that philosophy, and it could happen to you if you don't write your listing agreement correctly. So this is where I'm going to make the advice. And the advice is I recommend you write your agreement in such a way that it's just like the old days in the concept. It's the new way. If this happens, we're going to write it out. So here's what I mean. You're going to write out your listing agreement that says, hey, in my example, 10% being your total commission in the old days, and 5% is what you received as the listing broker and 5% to the buyer broker. The new day, you would write it up so, hey, you hire me, seller, to sell your home, and my commission is 5%. And that's what you'd write in, 5%. And that's what's going to happen if I sell your home. I'm representing you. And if anybody else brings us to buyer, I'll negotiate on your behalf and we'll make it happen and we're going to get this thing done. And then you're going to write in other options. It's going to be a variable commission. You're going to say, hey, but if another agent happens to pop over and bring us a buyer, then what I want you to do is I want you to be open to that, and we're going to negotiate with them what the commission is. See, in the old model, you would say what it is. Now you're going to have to say, if they bring us a buyer, we will negotiate with them. I don't know how much that's going to be, Mr. Seller or Mrs. Seller. It may be 1%, 2%, 10%, 50%. I don't know what they're going to ask. Whatever they ask for, we will then negotiate it with them to get the compensation in line. And you'll pay me my 5, and then you'll pay them something at the closing because the buyer is going to instruct you to pay them. Well, I don't like that, says the seller. I know, but this is the way you have to do it if you want to get your home sold. And ultimately, what do sellers want? Get the home sold, right? They want us to guide them through this process. All right, so your agreement's going to say, hey, in option B, where another agent comes in, I still get paid 5, but be open to the fact that you may have to pay it or stroke a check or write off a part of the fee, part of the seller net proceeds are going to go, not net proceeds, but seller proceeds are going to go over to a buyer's agent because you're being instructed to do that by a buyer. I'm going to come back to that when we talk about buyers. Next, you're going to need a third option. And the third option is I, the listing agent, am working with the buyer and the seller. You got to have that in the agreement right from the beginning, the listing agreement. And you're going to, my recommendation is you're going to write something up along the lines of, hey, I still get my 5% for representing you. However, if I'm going to have to go out there, if I bring in the buyer and I get the buyer and I write up the offer and we put this all together, I get paid 10%. It's like the old days, okay? Because I'm bringing all this stuff together. I'm out there marketing and prospecting and finding you a buyer. That's the way you have to talk to the seller because that's what they expect anyway, right? And you're saying, hey, in that situation, I get paid 10. Okay. So well, wait a minute, Mike, let's go back to situation A when they only got paid 5. Maybe the seller finds their own buyer, right? All of a sudden they put the sign up and they get some activity and it comes in that it's a buyer, is a friend or family member, whatever. You could have an arrangement where in that situation, you just get the 5 for writing up all the paperwork and negotiate, pull it all together and bring it to a closing because your marketing didn't generate the buyer. Another agent's marketing didn't generate the buyer. The sellers generated the buyer, right? Okay. You got to start thinking out of the box like this if you haven't already. So you have a variable structure in your commission where there's these different options based on what happens, how the buyer gets to you. And ultimately, that's what the seller cares about. Did you get a buyer and did we close? The rest of this doesn't really matter to me. I just want to move. All right. So that's what I want you to start thinking about is how you're going to structure your compensation. And my big point here is do not write up your listing agreement so that, hey, I only get this smaller commission amount, period, no matter how the property sells. Because if you do that and you end up working with the buyer too, you are double working. And no industry, other industry well, maybe they are, but most other industries, if you do double the work, you get double the pay. And that's logical and people understand that. Okay, so that's why you're going to want to write up your agreement that if you are the procuring cause, that was the old term, procuring cause, you brought in the buyer, then you're going to get both. You're going to get paid for working with the seller, and you're going to get paid for working with the buyer. Now, the representation that you have with the buyer, again, is a separate concept, and that's up to you as to whether you're working with them as a customer, working with them as a dual agent, working with them as a transaction broker. Again, whatever your state rules are, you might have something different in your state, but these are all things that have to be ironed out between you and your broker and your contracts. If you don't have a broker, you go to your lawyer and you get this all figured out. But you got to have it figured out before you meet with the seller. The beauty, the upside, you could be double ending more transactions. Make sure you get paid on both sides. So that's the big opportunity for sellers. By the way, I have a little 3-sentence paragraph to say that in my notes, and it took me like 20, 30 minutes to tell you what it was. So, I hope that was helpful. All right, let's move on to the buyer agent opportunity. Yes, I think there is an opportunity for buyer agents here. Buyer agency is probably, if this goes through, going to get shrunk. It's going to be harder to do, but not go away. Think about my referral agent idea. You're working with your best friend. You're working with your family member. You are not going to send them out to the woods. You are going to take them and you're going to put them under your arm and you're going to walk them around and help them through this process of buying a home. And you're going to get compensated for it. Okay. It's just in the old days, you would go into the MLS and you would look under the compensation, you'd see whatever was being offered, and you would receive that, or you would try to negotiate something different. In the old days, you could negotiate something different, right? We did all the time. If somebody was offering only $1 in the MLS, you're like, well, I'm not working for $1. So you would have to go negotiate for a different compensation structure. Okay. The difference is now, I think, how that negotiation is going to occur, because now it is going to become a negotiation. You're going to have multiple negotiations, right? You're going to negotiate with the buyer to get your buyer agency in place. You're going to negotiate with the seller representing the buyer. You're going to negotiate with the seller to put a contract in place. You're going to negotiate with the inspections like you've always been doing, right? You're going to negotiate any other problems that pop up. It's just now you're going to add another one. You're going to negotiate your compensation in the transaction. So you're either going to ask the buyer to pay you out of pocket, which is just not going to happen. Like, I just don't see it happening often. Maybe it will, but not likely, especially since it hasn't been standard in our industry and nobody's expecting it. What I do see is this. I see that you go and you get a buyer agency sign with your buyer. And in that, it says that you're going to get compensated, whatever it's going to be, if you're successful at finding them a home. In fact, in our contract, it still says a buyer agency agreement still calls it a success fee. In Colorado, yours may say something else, but you're going to get compensated if you find them a property and you get to close. Who's going to pay? So you can have it so the buyer pays. You can also, in that buyer agency agreement, you could have it so that the seller pays, okay? You could have it so the listing broker pays. You could write anything you wanted to that. You could have it so a lender pays, right? Maybe that's going to be a solution. Just kind of hit me in the head. I doubt it, but that's another option. So in the old days, I gave you that old story. I want you to remember the old story as we go into this buyer side. The old story was listing, the seller is out there, they hire a listing agent. The buyer's out there and they hire, they're working with an agent. Okay, this was the co-op agent. And in the old days, The seller paid the listing broker, and the listing broker paid the seller sub-agent, okay, who was working next to the buyer. Then the modification that happened in 93 was the seller paid the listing broker, and the listing broker paid the buyer agent. Ooh, it's the same flow of money, isn't it? It's exact same flow. Okay. It's just that they changed the name of this person over here. Okay. Remember that. All right. Who is paying, where's the source of the funds coming from? And although the mental gymnastics of, hey, the buyer's paying for it is true, I want you to just remember the flow of the actual cash. It went from seller to listing broker to buyer broker. But where did it all come from? Seller. This is going to be the key, I think, to the easy solution. Here's the easy solution. Today, well, in the new world, it's proposed. Buyer and seller are the parties to the buy contract. Yes? Yes. Buyer is obligated to pay their agent in my new world. Okay. However, the buyer, and we talked about this with the buyer, can get those funds from some other source to give to their buyer's agent. That's kind of the trick. Let me say that again. The buyer can go ahead and get the funds to pay their agent from any source that they can go out and find. And their agent is right next to them, is going to help them do that. That's you. Here is the most common scenario then. The buyer tells the seller, and the seller then acts on and pays directly the buyer's agent. They just bypass the listing broker. Okay. So the buyer the buyer instructs, and kind of pays, by the way, with the purchase price, instructs the seller to pay their buyer's agent from the proceeds of the sale directly. Okay. So instead of the seller paying the listing broker who pays the buyer's broker, the seller is just going to directly pay the buyer's broker. So the seller is going to write 2 checks if you want, if that's the way you want to see this. The seller is going to write one to the listing broker, and the seller is going to write one to the buyer's broker. Why would the seller do that? Because the seller wants to sell the home. And they were instructed to do that by the buyer. The buyer wasn't going to complete the purchase unless this happened. And so the seller said, okay, I ran the numbers and this still makes sense to me. I will do it. That's the way they've always done it. The seller runs all the numbers and goes, yeah, this makes sense to me. Go ahead and sell it. Or they run the numbers and they go, no, it doesn't. I mean, have you ever had a deal that doesn't come together? The offer is there and the seller says, I don't want that offer. Yeah, that's because you negotiate all the terms and the seller's looking at the bottom line number and they're looking at the dates and all the other things and they're making a decision, just like they're going to do in the new world. So do you think that's the solution you should be thinking about? The buyer hires a buyer agent, just like they always should have been, but this is going to be now a requirement. The buyer then instructs, here's another way to think this, by the way, the buyer instructs the buyer agent, hey, go out there and find out how to pay yourself. And the buyer agent says, I got a great idea. When we go negotiate the offer, we're going to write in that you're instructing the seller to pay me. Okay, so you're going to simply have the buyer say, yeah, I want you, I'm responsible for you. I want you to guide me through this thing as my Sherpa. Okay, however, I know you got to get compensated, but I can't just write a check out of my pocket. So I'm going to do whatever you tell me. And you say, go get it from the seller. Sure. So you go ahead and get the money from the seller because the buyer instructs the seller to pay the buyer agent. Solved. So now as a buyer's agent, every time you write an offer, instead of it being in the MLS, it's going to be right in your contract. You're going to write into additional provisions or some new form of the contract that's been written up where, hey, I'm going to, the buyer, because that's a party to the contract, instructs the seller to do something, which they can do. That's between those two. And in this case, the buyer is going to instruct the seller to pay the buyer broker commission, the sales commission. I think this also solves another problem or challenge. We'll find out. My guess is by doing it this way, because the seller is paying 2 commissions now, one to the seller's agent and one to the buyer's agent, just like they have in the past, the lenders are not going to consider these commissions as part of the seller concessions. The lenders are not going to consider these funds as part of the seller concessions. And so now the buyer can still ask for the full seller concessions allowed in the lender guidelines for whatever loan they're going for, because it's different depending on the loan, right? If it's conventional or it's an FHA or it's a VA, and based on the loan to value and all these little criteria, it could be as little as none. It could be 3%, 6%. It could actually be even 9%, by the way, if the buyer's putting down a lot of money in a certain type of loan. It just depends. What I'm saying is the buyer can still get the full benefit of whatever is allowed by the lender guidelines as far as seller concessions to the buyer to help them with the financing, help them with any, in the old days, again, we had escrows, which aren't typically done anymore. Maybe that'll come back if the market slows down enough. But anything that the seller pays for the buyer's benefit, this buyer agent commission is outside of that because you call it a sales commission, which it is. And the seller's already been doing a sales commission, okay? I think this is the simple solution in my humble opinion. Could be totally wrong, not legal advice. Talk to your broker, talk to your other agents. Well, your broker is the one you got to follow, and talk to your lawyer if you have a lawyer, again, if you're the broker. All right. That's how I think it's going to pop down for buyer agents. I think that smart buyer agents are going to be just fine. They're going to explain this to their clients. They're going to explain, hey, this is just the change that happened. I still represent you, can still work with you. Oh, but Mike, there are greedy people out there of sellers and buyers that don't want to pay us anymore. There have always been greedy people out there that don't want to pay us. That's fine. They're called for sell by owners, and they're called, I don't know, we don't really have a term for them, a buyer owner, buyer direct. I don't know, whatever they call them, where buyer goes direct to a FSBO. Cool. You can do that. I'll do that all day long. That's fine. You don't need me. Most people want the help. Most people want guidance through the process. Like you could go to court and you could represent yourself. You could hire an attorney or you could represent yourself. Most people go hire an attorney because there's all these weird twists and turns if you go through the court system, right? You don't have to hire an attorney. It's a nice guide. You're going to pay through the nose for it, right? Well, buyers don't have to hire agents, neither do sellers, but they do because they need someone to guide them through the process. Another optimistic view, right? For us, because they need us. All right. Let me just double check my notes. I think I hit everything. No. I think I just went through the directions there. Yeah, I think that we addressed everything. Now, I'm looking, I don't see any questions. We're going to do a Q&A, and I went so long, I lost a bunch of people up on calls. So if you have any questions, or those remaining, go ahead and ask them now. Just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask me a question. All right, I got no questions, so I'm assuming that everybody's okay with everything we talked about. But you're going to probably have questions as this comes along, and we're going to be talking more about it as this develops. I hope this gave you a little bit of optimism, showed you where there's some potential upside and benefits if you treat yourself as a professional and you think about this, how this is going to play out and how you can capitalize. I think, again, as a listing broker, you'd be doing a lot more transactions when you take that listing, just because there are going to be more buyers that come direct to you. You just have to make sure you know how you're going to work with them, have that all prearranged, and make sure that you're going to be compensated for that extra work. As the buyer agent, I think in a lot of ways it's going to be as usual, as long as you explain things to your buyer, line things up correctly with your buyer, and then you go ahead and get into going direct to having the seller paying you directly because they're being instructed by the buyer in the contract. I think that's going to be the change, where it used to happen all off contracts and off MLS. It happened off contract in the MLS. Now it's going to be off MLS and go right back into the contract. Another way to think about this. Hope that's been helpful. I hope you're excited. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and reach out to me and let me know. But I'm excited for you. Keep moving forward and take care. Bye now.